So with this in mind, let's start talking about marginal utility. So we have utility functions, and we can think now about marginal utility. So imagine we're consuming at bundle x1, x2. So we're consuming at one particular bundle. The question is how marginal utility is like how much, marginal utility of good one, is how much utility changes if we give a bit more of good one. So that'd be like the marginal utility of good one. So MU1, so marginal utility of good one, is the change in utility from a change in x1, a marginal, tiny change in x1. Well, this is going to be the utility at x1 plus that change in x1, x2, so we're holding x2 constant here, and we're going to subtract what the original utility was before we added this. If we want the marginal, it's going to be over the change in x1. So this is kind of holding the amount of good 2 fixed, right? And if we wanted the change in utility from that, that just equals the marginal utility from good 1 times the change in x1. So that's the total change in utility is, how much changing a marginal amount of x1 changes utility times the actual change that we see in utility. The actual amount we see that we've changed the amount of good 1 is what I'm trying to say. Hopefully that makes sense. The amount of added utility from a marginal change in x1 times the amount that x1 changed. That's a total change in utility. Maybe that's an easier way of saying that. So you could do the same thing with good 2. You're just going to put a 2 there and a 2 there, and now you're just changing good 2 but leaving good 1 constant. So you could do the same thing with good 2. The key here is that the magnitude of this marginal utility really has no behavioral meaning by itself. So no, the magnitude of marginal utility depends on the magnitude of utility. And we just said we could do any monotonic transformation of a utility function and it represents the same preferences. But now the marginal utility of let's say one of these goods, like that amount depends on what kind of functional form we chose or which particular monotonic transformation we chose. So different monotonic transformations, which, because they're monotonic transformations, represent the same preferences, will produce different amounts of marginal utility. So different monotonic, let's say transformations, I'm just being lazy, lead to different marginal utility. Example, if we multiply a utility function by 2, we've simply scaled up the marginal utility by 2, or by some amount. And so this kind of means the marginal utility itself has no kind of behavioral meaning or content. Behavioral content. So we can't calculate the marginal utility of a choice behavior, and so in itself it kind of has no behavioral content, but we can use it to say something useful, which is kind of like where we're going to go next, and we're going to kind of link it to, maybe the marginal rate of substitution is kind of where we're going. But on its own, marginal utility doesn't mean very much. So what we can do is use the utility function to calculate the marginal rate of substitution, which is like, remember, the slope of the indifference curve. So we can, the marginal utility is useful for that. So consider a change in amount of each good. So the marginal utility of 1 times the marginal utility of good 1 times the change in good 1 plus the marginal utility of good 2 times the change in good 2 equals that change in utility. If we're along the same indifference curve, that change in utility should be 0, right? And so then we're just going to rearrange this. So the change in utility is 0, so we have this equals 0, right? So then we're just going to rearrange this. And we know that the marginal rate of substitution equals the change in x2 over the change in x1. And that's going to be equal to minus the marginal utility of good 1 over the marginal utility of good 2. Notice that it's 2 over 1 and 1 over 2. So remember that. All I'm doing there is like setting this equal to 0 and solving, basically, right? I'm going to move this over to the left-hand side, divide both by the change in x, and move this over to the other side. Hopefully that's not too bad algebra for you. And we can kind of measure this by looking at people's actual behavior. So we can measure by looking at a person's behavior. Going back to what we learned last chapter, we can find the exchange rate such that they're just indifferent towards trading and not, right? So find the rate of exchange that they are just willing to stay put. Because we remember we talked about, offering them an exchange rate of, E is the one we used in the last chapter, and remember that the slope of the indifference curve, the only time they'd, be kind of indifferent between making that trade or not, or just being willing to stay put, is when the slope of the indifference curve equaled that exchange rate. So the utility function is not unique, and which means the marginal utility is not unique, but the ratio of marginal utilities is independent of which utility function you chose. Which is key, which is why it has behavioral meaning, because it's the ratio of them. So hopefully that makes sense, but let's just write it down, just in case. Utility function, not unique, which means that the marginal utility is not unique, which means it kind of has no behavioral meaning, but the ratio of marginal utilities is independent of the particular transformation that you made. Of the utility function. for instance, if I did a monotonic transformation of a utility function where I multiply it by 2, essentially we'd be getting, 2 times the original marginal utility of good 1 over 2 times the original marginal utility of good 2, and so those 2's are just canceling. And so this is like, the marginal utilities can be used to calculate, and they are independent of which utility function you particularly chose, like which transformation, I should say, that you chose to make. The ratio of the marginal utilities is independent of that. And so it can say something behavioral, and we can use it, we can actually measure it by like offering people things and seeing where they're just kind of indifferent towards making a trade, or they just want to stay put.